Now can you hear me? Now? Okay, I have to not cough or sneeze. You can hear me, seriously? Okay. Okay, so feels a little bit like there's something hovering in front of my face, but that's okay. So it's that time of the day where you bring in the developmental psychologist to revive everyone, stupor of formalism, and I promise to show you children failing incredibly at simple tasks in videos and so on, the purpose of my visit. So the work that I'm going to tell you about today was actually done, it began originally at McGill, and this is how I was introduced to the work of Gennaro. As an undergraduate, I was working with, better? A little better. I was, my college roommate was Alan Bale, and he, of course, was a linguist. I was studying psychology at McGill, and so we started collaborating on projects together. And one of the projects that we worked on was related to the relationship between the syntax and semantics of nouns and verbs, which essentially degenerated into a project on the mass count distinction, where we thought we could get better traction on the relationship between grammatical categories and their interpretation, especially in the case of acquisition, which is what I was mainly interested in. And so this is where we first came across the work of Gennaro. This is not on. Here we go. So there was this claim that in the psychology literature that you could solve both the problem of how the mass count distinction was interpreted and also the acquisition of the distinction, and more generally the acquisition of grammatical categories from the perspective of syntax, or a theory of syntactic development, if there were straightforward correspondences between syntax and semantics and acquisition, such that you could go back and forth between syntax and semantics in the following way. So if a noun is used in count syntax, then you can infer as a competent speaker of English that the noun refers to individuals like rabbits, right? But if the same noun is used in mass syntax, then you can infer that it refers to something else like rabbit substance, okay, like this stuff. And from the perspective of the child, if you actually haven't acquired these grammatical categories yet, you can make corresponding inferences backwards. So for any noun that's used to refer to a set of individuals, you can infer that it's a count noun, or at least you can search for corresponding kind of evidence, syntactic correspondence of that type. And for any non-individual, you can infer, or you can search for evidence of a category like mass. And so there are kind of vague proposals of this type in the literature, whereby you can go back and forth, and these are mainly psychologists, but of course this type of theory also coexists in the linguistics literature, where you see different domains posited for count and mass. And so we have this question of that pops up, especially on the psychology and philosophy of language side, which doesn't have much to do with the formal theory of the type that Gennaro was necessarily interested in, which is, I mean, the question is how do we tell what counts as an individual for any given noun, okay? So in the case of rabbit, we have this issue of how do you decide, for example, here, whether there's actually one rabbit or two rabbits or no rabbits at all, right? So this is not really a question of formal semantics, but now we're talking about something on the level of conceptual semantics. So what I want to talk about here is how these might interface with each other in a complete theory. So how do we know how many rabbits there are there? So I have this quote from Frege. He says, "Only a concept which isolates what falls under it in a definite manner and doesn't permit arbitrary division of it into parts can be a unit relative to a finite number." And so he's talking here, this is a requirement of his theory of number and one of the basic axioms that he begins with, a basic observation. But in order to get this off the ground, you need to know what this concept is. So you have to have some kind of criteria for what counts as an individual for any given noun like rabbit. And I think that that's true ultimately if you want to verify, or if you want to empirically verify a theory of the mass count distinction, you need to actually know what counts as an individual in order to test the idea that count nouns individuate and mass nouns don't. And so you see proposals like this in the literature. I mean, for example, this claim that count nouns are sortals, so they supply different types of conceptual criteria like application, identity, and individuation. But really this is just true of pretty much any theory of concepts, that you need criteria for identifying individuals in the world, differentiating, for example, the application of nouns like apple and orange, and determining what counts as a whole apple or a whole orange. The problem with this as a starting point for a theory, for a semantic theory, or as a requirement, is that it turns out to be impossibly difficult to do. So if you pick just any word in English, say, and try to provide a satisfying definition, it turns out to be very, very difficult to do that, right? And so this, obviously, the classical theory is an attempt to do that, and you have famous arguments from people like Fodor showing that even for really prototypical cases of definitions like bachelor, you can find all kinds of exceptions. And certainly when it comes to words like apple and orange, it's very difficult to provide satisfying definitions that differentiate them. But this is what's supposed to do the work of defining what counts as a whole individual or a whole rabbit. So the problem then arises, there are no definitions, it seems, or at least we haven't found any yet. And so we don't really have a proposal with regards to what counts as a whole individual rabbit. And so we have a situation where it's very difficult to verify theories, semantic theories, with respect to the different denotations they propose for count nouns and mass nouns. So a hypothesis is that actually sortals are not stored in the lexicon as count nouns, but that they're the product of computation. Okay, that we can't actually provide definitions per se, but that we can get more or less the equivalent via computations that involve a pragmatic inference. Okay. And the way we get there is by positing a lexical root that provides some kind of necessary conditions for reference, or some kind of necessary conditions for the concept, a syntactic frame which specifies individuation, and then a pragmatic inference that I'll describe in a moment. This is just a reiteration of that idea, that you start with a lexical root that provides necessary conceptual conditions for individuation, syntax, which in English, but not in all languages, licenses individuation, and then pragmatics, which strengthens the lexical concept to provide sufficient conditions in the case of reference only. Okay. So I'll divide this up into two parts. And the first part has to do specifically with the mass count distinction and what the different lexical and syntactic sources of individuation might be in language. And then in the second part, I'll show you these kind of bizarre behaviors that we find in kids up till the age of 6 or 7, which suggests some kind of pragmatic inference going on that's used to strengthen and generate individuals. And I'll suggest that prior to 6 or 7 years of age, kids are not spontaneously doing this. Okay, so here's that thing I showed you before. There's this proposal in the literature that there's a one-to-one correspondence between mass and count. But what I want to do is show you that this isn't true, and that this gives us evidence that there's in fact lexical representations or lexical specification of individuation, and distinct from that syntactic specification, and that these two interact with each other to generate interpretations of mass and count nouns. And this begins with this observation from Kerkia and also Brendan Gillen, that you have nouns that violate this one-to-one correspondence. So what I've called here object mass nouns. So these are words like furniture and ammunition, luggage, and so on. Importantly, these are all mass nouns, but they denote things in the world that are countable individuals, right? So this is what Gillen says. He says world knowledge tells us that ammunition has minimal parts or atoms known as rounds. And Gennaro argues that all mass nouns denote pluralities of individuals and come out of the lexicon with plurality already built in. And that this is really the only way that they differ from count nouns. Okay. There's a second important claim, though, related to Pavarotti, which is that if you look across languages and you have the cognate words or words that have the same, purportedly same denotations like hair in Spanish, English, French, and Italian, they should pick up the same things. So hair, spinach, toast, broccoli, etc. If we don't want semantics to start looking like magic, we have to say that in the real world, hair and capello obviously denote the same stuff. Okay, so these two claims are important to evaluate together. And I think that you can't have both of these. You can only probably have one of them. Okay. So the prediction here is that first, object-masked words should denote pluralities, as Gennaro predicts. And that the mass count distinction, when it comes to these words, shouldn't affect the interpretation directly. That hair and capella should just be the same thing. And critically, you want to evaluate this with respect to the mental representations involved, not just the things in the world, because we already know prior to this investigation that hair in Italy is the same as hair in France and in the United States, et cetera, right? So it's not about the stuff in the world. That's not what we're interested in. We're interested in the mental representations of these different things. So the question is, does mass syntax cause you to have some kind of unindividuated representation of hair, or mental representation, or some kind of different construal of the same objects? Or is there in some way in which the sense of these words is different across languages, despite their denotations being the same? So the way we try to get at this is through this quantity judgment task, where we just ask people, for example, here, who has more rabbits? And the answer is this guy. And then you can get the clearly different intuition if we say, who has more rabbit? Now, you're not going to evaluate this question on the basis of number, but instead on the basis of the total amount of rabbit stuff, right? So clearly, the mass count distinction in this case of rabbit is shifting construal and causing you in one case to make your judgment on the basis of number, and in the second case on the basis of total amount of stuff in this particular case. And so this suggests that quantification is really based on individuation and also is evidence for it. Okay. And so one of these studies we did, I'm not going to show you all of them, but one of them we did is just like this. We showed kids, because we were interested in acquisition, and also adults, different types of nouns, like count nouns like shoe, cup, candle, these sort of prototypical substance mass nouns like toothpaste and ketchup, and then these object mass nouns. And the question is simply, do these object mass nouns pattern with count nouns or with substance nouns? Okay, given that they denote individuals. And what we found is that they pattern like count nouns. So this is just the percentage of times that people base their judgments on number when we contrast volume with number. Okay, so for example, we show them silverware, and there might be 2 pieces here and 6 pieces here. It doesn't really matter. And we ask who has more silverware. Okay, and in these cases, people base their judgments on number, whether they're adults or they're 4-year-old kids. As long as they know the word, they'll do this. The critical question is, what happens when you go to words like stone and hair and spinach and so on? And the answer there is it depends on what language you speak. So if you speak English and I present you stone as a count noun, then you base your judgments on number. If I present it to you as a mass noun, you base your judgments on total volume. If you speak French, then you get different intuitions. So it turns out that stone is the same in English and French, but broccoli isn't. Okay, so in French, broccoli is a count noun, and in English, it's a mass noun. In French, subjects go on the basis of number, and in English, on the basis of volume. And spinach as well. So in French, you say des épinards, and people base their judgments on number. In English, you say some spinach, and people base their judgments on total volume. So it's clear in these cases, like rabbit, that syntax is shifting the interpretation. And so you see this shift based on syntax in English. In French, these words that are mass in English are based on number, because French has a very strong count bias relative to English. And in Japanese, where you don't have a mass count distinction, what you find for almost all of these words that are flexible, whether between languages or within a language, is that the Japanese speakers go right in between, okay? As though the words were ambiguous between the 2 interpretations. So this suggests that there's really some kind of lexical representation which supports either of these meanings, and that syntax can shift you between them. So there's a lexical root that is, if you like, ambiguous, and syntax can pick between these. So you have a syntactic specification of meaning in combination with a lexical concept that provides 2 different interpretations. You can summarize this as follows. Whenever you have count syntax, the noun will be interpreted on the basis of number, But whenever you have math syntax, you can have any number of different dimensions that are picked out for measurement, including number, but also mass or volume, or other dimensions like wisdom, hope, fun, and so on. So in fact, if I say, do you have more wisdom or string? That's a ridiculous question. Or do you have more hope or string? You can't answer it. But if I ask, do you have more hopes than strings? That's a perfectly tractable question, so long as you know exactly how many hopes and strings you have, right? Presumably there's a specific amount somewhere. And so by coercing to count syntax, there's a commensurable dimension on which you can make these judgments. And in math syntax, that's not true. There is no single dimension for making these quantity judgments. Okay, so the idea here is that there are these lexical roots. Depending on which way you go, you get different interpretations. But I still haven't answered the question of how you know what counts as a whole rabbit. And so that's the point of this next part. Okay, so I've told you how, once you know what a whole rabbit is, you get the final interpretation. But we still haven't answered this problem of what these lexical criteria are that define individuals. Okay, so here's the weird behavior, which is if you ask a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or some delayed 7-year-olds how many forks there are here, what they'll do is count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so let me just show you an example of that, if I can find it quickly here. Oh, maybe I won't. Oh, there we go, good. Particularly cute subject. Oh, I don't know if I have audio, though. Where is there audio? Oh. Thanks. Someone can hear me. Okay, great. Okay, so this is a 4-year-old child. My daughter, Anouk.
Oh, no. Can you count the shoes? Can you count the shoes? 1, 2, 3, 4. Good job.
So, a couple things to notice there is one, she noticed right away that there's something wrong, and that's a pretty common behavior. So we show them these broken objects, and they, oh dear. Will that work? Yes. So we show them these broken objects, and oh damn. And they notice right away that the object is broken, and some of the kids will try to push them together, and they'll complain, that this is broken. And then when you ask them to go ahead and count the objects, they'll nevertheless count them as separate. And they do this until they're about 6 years of age. And it's a pretty overwhelming, strong behavior. Okay, and actually they'll do this in all kinds of strange situations. Like if you tell them only to count the whole objects, they'll continue to do this. These are 5, 6-year-olds. If you push the objects together and ask them to count, and then pull them apart, they'll change their answer, and so on. And there are many experiments we've done. This is just a small sample. One of them is if you just show them a thing like this, you say, this guy has some shoes, or these guys have some shoes, who has more shoes? Then they'll judge that this guy has more than this guy. Okay, so this isn't a counting task per se. If we say, what does this guy Bob have? They'll say, about 40% of the kids will say he has some forks. If we say, can you put a ball in the circle? Kids will be happy just to put half of one in. Okay. If I say, put both of the ones you like into the circle, kids will take 1.5 very frequently. If you say, touch every plate, they'll touch each part of a plate. And of course, if you ask them to count the socks, they'll count each part of a sock. Okay, so you find this behavior in many different tasks. So like I said, they'll change their count if you glue objects together or take them apart. And they'll say explicitly that they're broken. If you say, is there anything wrong with this? Almost all the kids will say yes. And if you say, what is it? They'll say, it's broken. Okay. So what's going on here? So one possibility is that initially rabbit means just any old object that has rabbit properties, which is something I guess maybe Quine would be happy with, right? So any part of a rabbit just is a rabbit. So the prediction of this is that any part of a rabbit should count as one rabbit. But that turns out not to be true. So kids aren't completely stupid. If you show them rabbits and cut off their ears, or you take trash cans and lids or clowns and cut off their arms, you cut the legs off of tables, the wheels off of bicycles, et cetera, et cetera. You can cut up any number of things. Critically, kids will not count those parts. They almost never count them. Only about 10% of the time will they do that. Okay? And critically, these parts are nameable. So the reason, perhaps, why they're not counting these as rabbits is because they're ears, right? They're not rabbits, they're ears. In other words, there's a better description available for these things than rabbit. Okay? So kids, the hypothesis that we put forward is that the reason that kids fail, by the way, this behavior I just showed you, that's 3 and 4-year-olds. They have no difficulty with this at all. Okay. Now, the reason that kids fail up until the age of 6 with whole objects that you cut into arbitrary parts is that they don't have any better description for those arbitrary parts until they're about 5 or 6. That's not actually totally true. They do have better descriptions available, but the claim is just that they can't access them as better alternatives. Okay? So for words like ear and foot and leg and arm, those are readily available, and kids bring them to bear and obviously consider them as alternative descriptions and rule out those parts as rabbits. But they make these errors for arbitrary pieces up until the age of 6. So what we wanted to do is get at this in a couple of different ways. First, we started with totally novel objects. So we showed kids objects like these. Let's call them blickets. Okay? And sometimes these had functional parts like this. Okay, this is actually, this should be labeled as an arbitrary part. So this is a blicket. This is a blicket that we broke into 2 arbitrary parts. This is a blicket that we broke into 2 parts, but this one has a separate function. Okay? And sometimes we explain that to kids. Sometimes we give them a label. So in this case, say we break the blicket, and then we don't give this any particular label. Sometimes we will actually label this part, though. Okay, so we'll say this is these are some blickets, and this part right here is a toma, or something else. And sometimes we'll have unlabeled, this should be functional parts, so the opposite. So parts that look like they have some separate function. And sometimes we'll label them, and sometimes we won't. Also, sometimes we demonstrated the functions explicitly, and sometimes we didn't. So we would say this is for doing the following. Okay. And what we found is that when you don't label, okay, arbitrary parts, so this is this case where you don't provide any label, so there's no competing label for this thing, and there's no clear function for this thing. The best label for it is really blicket. Kids continue to count the individual parts, not the whole objects. But if there's a label and a function, or just a clear different function that we've provided, or there's a label given even for the arbitrary parts, we call this a toma. In all of those cases, kids exclude those parts because they have a better label for them. Okay. So if parts have labels or they have some other property that clearly indicate that these are a different kind of thing, then they don't include them under the word blicket. Okay, just like they don't include rabbit ears under the label rabbit when they're counting rabbits. If parts are arbitrary and they have no label, then they just count them as members of the basic kind, blicket in this case. Or if they're arbitrary rabbit parts, they count them as rabbits. Okay, so this explains why a rabbit ear isn't a rabbit, right? But it doesn't actually explain why kids count half a rabbit as a rabbit until they're the age of 6. And then it just goes away. I thought this was interesting, by the way, also because this is around the same time when kids begin to succeed or show better performance on other types of tasks that appear to involve accessing alternatives like scalar implicature. And I'm not sure, there's certainly nothing formally similar about these, but there might be something cognitively similar, which is that you have to bring to bear competing linguistic representations and contrast them. So here's the idea, is that nouns are restricted by other lexical nouns, but also by other noun phrases that denote parts. So how do you figure out what counts as a whole rabbit? Well, you consider the possibility that this thing might also be labeled as a piece of rabbit. So if it can be labeled as a piece of rabbit, if that's a better description, then it's not a rabbit. Okay. So critically, in order to rule out a piece of rabbit, you have to have this description in your lexicon, and second, you have to be able to bring it to bear when you're doing this type of task. So the first thing we did is just asked, when do kids know the meanings of these descriptions? And the answer is at least by 4. So, and we showed this in 2 different tasks, but here's an example of one where we just show kids a broken thing or 2 things, and then there are these 2 characters. So Farmer Brown says it's 2 shoes, and Captain Blue says it's 2 pieces of shoe. Who said it better? So in this case, kids would say, oh, Captain Blue said it better because it's 2 pieces of shoe. And in this case, they'd say Farmer Brown said it better because there are 2 shoes. And this is by the age of 4 at least. Okay. So they seem to comprehend these measure descriptions by at least 4, but nevertheless, these same kids will fail at a task where we ask them to count these things. Okay. So what we did in the next experiment is, this is just reiterating this, is we tried priming them with these different descriptions before then subsequently giving them the counting task. So what we tried to do is give them those alternatives and then ask them to count. Okay. So we just did this little bit of training before. We said point to the pieces of shoe, now point to the shoes, something they already knew. We just showed you that. So it's not that they didn't know this. We're not teaching them something new about the meanings of these expressions. What we're doing is we're reminding them that they know this. Okay. So we get them to point to pieces of shoe or point to shoes, and then we show them a full array of objects, like 6 objects, 1 of which is broken, and we just ask them to count the shoes. Okay. They're still not perfect in this case, but you can see that there's a very big difference between kids who get the priming. These are these kids, so the percentage of times counting parts is below 40%, and kids who don't get the priming, who are still up where we found kids before at around 70% counting parts. Okay. So the idea there is that what's going on is, now there's a couple things going on. One is that the lexical item for these kids, rabbit, isn't sufficient for picking out a whole object, right? What determines that a whole rabbit is a rabbit is in fact both the lexical item rabbit and the alternative descriptions that the child has available to them. Which isn't to say that rabbit means any object with rabbit properties, because we already showed that that's not true of things like ears and so on. It's that there are perhaps necessary conditions for being rabbit, but not sufficient conditions for picking out what counts as a whole rabbit. Now, I'm not going to say what those are, because that would, again, require a theory of concepts. But I think what the point here is that it at least provides a little bit of hope that we might be able to have some kind of conceptual semantics that doesn't have to do the full work of describing necessary and sufficient conditions. That this actually isn't a requirement of the conceptual semantics, because we can draw on pragmatic inference and the constraints that it places on reference in particular as well in this case. So the idea here is that these adult meanings emerge right from the beginning, that the 3- and 4-year-old kids in these studies have the adult meanings, but that when you combine those with a numeral, they're not arriving at the adult response because they don't yet have the restriction placed on the word by the contrasting alternatives like piece of and so on. So the conclusion of that is that these adult roots don't exclude arbitrary parts. that in fact a piece of a rabbit, an arbitrary part of a rabbit, is in some sense a rabbit unless it's a part of a rabbit. And this makes better intuitive sense if you think of borderline cases. So after your car has been in a wreck and it's parked on your lawn on blocks and it's really not functional and there's only really scraps of it left, it's still the best description is to say that's my car, right? You wouldn't even say that's a piece of my car because maybe the other pieces are blown to smithereens, right? It's really my car. And there are other situations like this where just the best description of the thing is the whole object label. So the same claim is being made here, but under conditions like the ones I described where you cut a rabbit in half, you have a better description available. So in those cases, the part description is better. All right. So the conclusion then is that nouns might provide necessary conditions for reference, but not sufficient conditions. And these necessary conditions, whatever they are consistent with both parts and wholes. Syntax specifies individuation. So when it comes to this type of lexical meaning, it will, in a language like English, tell you whether or not the noun individuates or refers to, in contrast to substance, but it doesn't alone tell you what the whole object is. This requires some additional work by contrasting with another description, like a part description or a measure word description. Okay, so here's the whole idea laid out just like that. So you begin with a lexical root. This is projected into master count syntax and then strengthened pragmatically by contrast to measure words. Okay, and just want to thank these people who worked on this project with me, and also, of course, Gennaro, especially for the data in the first part, which got me working on this problem in the first place of mass count distinction. Thanks.
So the difference in the adult interpretation of these singular count nouns and the children's is actually that the adult have to do an extra step where they consider all the other ways that you could describe the pieces. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so then my question is, would you actually expect adults to get these crazy counting effects if you provided them with a distractor task or something, or timed them really fast? Is it actually still active in our mental
Yeah, the question is how you could impair the measure word representation sufficiently without making a zombie out of the subject. But yeah, presumably, in theory, you should be able to do that. The question is how to, you'd need a good set of tweezers to do that. And I'm not sure that you could, but there's difficulty in any reaction time study because, of course, you have to perceive the stimuli. And here, a rabbit part looks an awful lot like a rabbit. But yeah, you could make that prediction. Gennaro? Oh, yeah.
So I was hoping you could say more about the logic of the priming in your second experiment and how it is that, so why you think that you're not just priming, for example, counting in general, or that there could be better ways of saying things, not those specific alternatives. So in introducing this doubt in their mind that there might be other ways to describe these parts.
Mm-hmm. So, well, yeah, so we're not priming counting per se, because we're not asking them to count in the priming task. What we're really doing is just asking, asking them to identify which one is a better
But
description.
to do that, they have to count, right? They have to say there are these two things.
I suppose they don't count for sets of two generally. Kids this age subitize for small sets. Yeah, I see. No, they don't have to. They don't have to engage in any counting behavior to do that. Yeah. But still, it could be. You're right that there might be something more general going on, which is we could be saying, be sensitive to informativeness or search for the most informative description or the best description.
So my worry is that if kids who were in, the control condition, if they encountered numerals like the kids in the priming condition, would they behave differently as well?
Well, there weren't numerals in the priming condition.
I thought it was here are two shoes. Is this better?
Oh, I
Here are
see.
two pieces of shoe.
Right. I don't see any theoretical reason why they would be different. Yeah. I mean, in all previous cases, when we test kids, we're really asking them to do that type of evaluation, to count, right? And whenever they're spontaneously counting, they're doing the wrong thing. What we're really doing here is we're just reminding kids of how they would, of their own knowledge of the measure word versus the non-measure description. And then in the counting task, the question is, do they use that when they count?
Yeah. So I was actually wondering, based on the experiments you were showing, whether it is really about the, in a sense, labeling or being a functional part. Because imagine that you just, let's say you have a cat as an object, and you just show a cat without an end of its tail. Yeah. Not the whole tail is cut off, but just a very small piece. I mean, it's not something that you have a better label for. It's not any functional part. But I would expect that it will not count as a separate cat for a child, because it's just some irrelevant part of the object. So there is, and the experiments with the arbitrary objects with arbitrary names doesn't really, at least as far as I have seen, doesn't really allow for, in a sense, differential analysis of this. So like, do you have any data about that, or?
I think there's a Monty Python skit about this. But I mean, it's a sort of a general intuition. So how much, how much can I slice off of myself before I'm not Dave anymore, right? Like, what's the minimal part?
Yeah. I mean, also the example with the rabbit, I mean, if you cut off the rabbit's ears, the rabbit doesn't stop to be a rabbit. But if you cut a rabbit into two halves, I mean, you don't know, okay, is it still a rabbit or not? I mean, you have, or do you now end up with two rabbits, yeah? So.
Well, I suspect that one thing you can do, I'm not sure, to if you wanted to deal with the really gory situations like the one you described, you can place a caveat, which is that whatever the parts are, to be countable, they have to fall under some kind, and maybe just a little bit of a tail doesn't count as anything. But if it's big enough to count as something, then it's, obviously, if it's falling under some label, it's going to be counted under that label. If it doesn't, if it's like too small to fall under any category, then it's not going to fall under cat, like the tip of a tail. But how much cat is enough cat? I don't know. I mean, that's the kind of the point, I guess, is that theory of concepts can't really say how much cat is enough cat. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, given the role that these parts, these all parts all have in your investigation, I was wondering if similar studies have been replicated for languages where you don't have a singular plural distinction of nouns, but you have a wider use of classifiers. So that whenever you ask the question is something like how many, not just pieces of, but according to the kind of matter you're talking about, you vary. And so kids are exposed way more often to those.
That's what we thought. I mean, in Chinese, we did studies in Chinese. It turns out that kids, they acquire measure words at exactly the same age in Chinese as they do in English. So they use classifiers, of course, in obligatory contexts, but they don't necessarily, first of all, classifiers are slightly different from the types of measure words like piece of, part of. You can make some kind of syntactic differentiation between, for example, a classifier that you would use to talk about a pen versus a piece of pen or something. But really, Chinese kids aren't acquiring the meanings of these classifiers until the same age as English kids. They struggle with measure word descriptions to the same extent, and they show the exact same trajectory as English kids. Yeah. That being said, we have tested other groups and found For example, we have some data from Mayan adults, and they do bizarre things on this until, the oldest subjects we tested, like 50 and 60-year-old subjects, would still count parts, and I have no idea why. Yeah. But there are many differences between that population, and both Japanese and American, or Chinese and American kids, for example, or adults. Yeah.
Can you go back to your conclusions? This is very interesting. No, before the schema that you had.
Oh, that one?
So, can you elaborate a little bit more on the intuition that you are pursuing here? So what you're saying is that this strange behavior of kids happens because the concept of rabbit per se doesn't tell you anything about the individuation.
It doesn't tell you enough to differentiate whole rabbits from rabbit parts, or to tell you that a part of a rabbit isn't a rabbit.
And why does this help with this behavior? So, I'm not getting exactly how are you jumping to this conclusion.
Well, we want to explain the fact that kids are ready to count parts of rabbits as rabbits, to the same extent that they're willing to count whole rabbits as rabbits. And one explanation of that is that both of these count as rabbits, right? Unless they count as something else. And one thing that can happen is they fall under some other noun, like ear, in which case they're not rabbits. Or they can fall under some other description, like piece of rabbit. Now,
Okay.
you still need to know what the difference is between a piece of a rabbit and a rabbit.
Okay.
Maybe that's what you're asking.
Well, I'm simply trying to get at what you are saying.
Yeah.
But now, so if rabbit and rabbit parts and arbitrary rabbit parts count for children just like count noun, isn't also the same for mass nouns? So wouldn't you expect then a child to be able to say, as easily 3 bloods as, right? So if you have 3 arbitrary pieces of bloods, wouldn't you expect then a child to be able to, how many bloods are there?
Yeah.
And to take it as completely...
Sure. I mean, yeah, because there's a presupposition that you're considering those things to be individuals in the question. So I guess if you asked how many bloods are there, they would say 3 or 4.
Okay, so this can be investigated.
Yeah, and kids do that. So if you introduce to them novel substances, it's not easy for them.
Yeah.
But they will treat these things as individuals if you name them using a count noun.
Yeah.
They don't like it, but they'll do it.
Well, see, what worries me is when something is posited for children that doesn't happen in some language. That, so part of the problem is this: there is a pretty tremendous variation in the linguistic manifestation of the mass count contrast, right? So the way in which that contrast is manifested in number marking languages is very different from the way it's manifested in classifier languages. It's yet very different from the ways in which it is manifested in number neutral languages like Denesuline, say. And it's yet again very different from the way it's manifested in languages like say, Yuja, right? But what doesn't happen so far, what I've never heard of so far, is any language that lets you say, you know, lets you take a canoe, divide it in 3 parts, physical or just ideal, and say, now you've got 3 canoes. That never, ever happens insofar as I know. Not even in UJA.
I agree that that would be an additional piece of evidence, but you know, recall that all the failures that we see in children of scalar implicature don't prevent us from making the exact same types of inference about the nature of scalar implicature in adults, right? So, and the same type of argument is being made. It's not the claim.
Well,
in the case
but if you're saying that concepts per se allow you to do that in principle, so that the concept of rabbit is truly identical to the concept of blood.
Yeah, it's exactly
With
the same
respect to
argument as
counting,
saying that.
then wouldn't you expect that to find such a language?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly the same claim as saying that sum doesn't exclude reference to, you know, an entire set. And that's what you see in the case of children as well. But in every language where...
I don't think it's the same, but okay. Let me...
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry, because I know you have your hand up and
Continue the discussion on the topic.
yeah.
We are supposed to come back in 15 minutes.